The silence at Riverside shooting range was deafening. Not the kind of quiet you'd expect at a place where gunshots echoed daily, but the uncomfortable hush that fell over a crowd when they witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chun stood at lane 7, her shooting glasses pushed up onto her forehead, a black bandana tied firmly across her eyes. In her hands, a standard .22 caliber rifle that moments before had been dismissed as beginner's equipment by the men surrounding her. "This is ridiculous," muttered Frank Morrison, the range's longtime instructor, crossing his arms. "I can't allow this. It's dangerous." But Sarah had already positioned herself, feet shoulder-width apart, the rifle raised to her shoulder with the kind of fluid precision that made the skeptics fall silent. What happened next would turn a quiet Tuesday afternoon into the most talked about day in the range's 30-year history. 3 months earlier, Sarah Chun had walked into Riverside shooting range for the first time, clutching a Groupon voucher for a beginner's shooting lesson. At 28, she worked as a software engineer at a tech startup downtown, spending her days debugging code and her evenings in the same routine: takeout dinner, Netflix, bed. Her life was predictable, comfortable, and utterly unremarkable. The range sat on the outskirts of Denver, a sprawling concrete building that looked more like a warehouse than a place where people came to learn marksmanship. Sarah had bought the Groupon on impulse during a particularly boring lunch break, thinking it might be an interesting way to spend a Saturday afternoon. She'd never held a gun before, never had any interest in firearms, but something about the idea of learning a completely new skill appealed to her systematic mind. Frank Morrison had been working at Riverside for 15 years, and he'd seen every type of newcomer walk through those doors. The nervous executives trying to impress clients, the suburban moms who'd watched too many action movies, the college kids looking for thrills. Sarah fit neatly into his mental category of tech worker having a quarter-life crisis. "First time?" Frank asked, not looking up from the paperwork as Sarah approached the counter. "Yes," Sarah replied, sliding the printed Groupon across the scratched surface. "I have no idea what I'm doing." Frank glanced at her petite frame, wire-rimmed glasses, a Stanford hoodie that had seen better days. He'd run through the safety briefing 1,000 times, usually for people who'd forget everything the moment they left. But there was something about the way Sarah listened that caught his attention. She didn't just nod along. She asked questions. Specific questions about stance, breathing, sight alignment. Questions that showed she was actually processing the information. "Most people just want to shoot something," Frank found himself saying as he led her to the range. "They don't care about the fundamentals." Sarah adjusted her safety glasses and ear protection. "I'm not most people." Her first shots were terrible. The kind of terrible that made Frank wince and other shooters glance over with knowing smirks. She jerked the trigger, flinched at the recoil, and sent rounds scattered across the paper target in a pattern that resembled abstract art more than marksmanship. "It's harder than it looks," Frank said, not unkindly. He'd given this speech before. It takes time to develop muscle memory. But Sarah didn't seem frustrated. If anything, she appeared more focused. She asked Frank to explain the mechanics again. About how the slight pressure from her finger should be a smooth pull, not a jerk. She wanted to understand the physics of why her shots were going wide, the biomechanics of how her body should move. By the end of the hour, she'd managed to hit the target consistently, though her groupings were still scattered. Frank had seen better first-time shooters, but he'd also seen much worse. What struck him was her methodical approach. While others got excited about hitting the target at all, Sarah seemed to be cataloging every variable that might affect her accuracy. "Same time next week?" Frank asked as she gathered her things. "Actually," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "What's your schedule like? I'd like to come more often." That was when Frank Morrison made his first mistake. He chuckled. "Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but shooting isn't like programming. You can't just debug your way to being good at it." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. "We'll see." She came back 3 days later. Then 2 days after that. Within 2 weeks, she was at the range every evening after work, methodically working through different drills Frank had shown her. She bought her own equipment, nothing fancy, just a basic rifle and standard ammunition. She kept a notebook, writing down details about each session, weather conditions, her physical state, what she'd eaten, how much sleep she'd gotten. "She's obsessive," Frank told his colleague, Marcus Webb, as they watched Sarah through the office window. She was at her usual lane, working through the same sequence of shots she'd been practicing for days. "I've never seen anything like it." Marcus, who'd been teaching at the range for 3 years, shrugged. "Some people get hooked. Remember that accountant who started coming last year? He's pretty good now." But Sarah was different. The accountant had plateaued after a few months, settling into a comfortable level of competence. Sarah seemed to treat every session like a puzzle to solve. She'd spend 10 minutes adjusting her stance by millimeters, then fire 5 rounds to test the change. She'd practice the same motion over and over until it became automatic. Other regulars at the range began to notice her. There was something unsettling about her focus, the way she could shut out everything else and zero in on the target. Tom Bradley, a retired police officer who'd been shooting for 30 years, found himself watching her sessions. "She's got potential," he told Frank one evening. "But she's too technical. Shooting's about feeling, not thinking." Frank nodded, but privately he wasn't so sure. Sarah's scores were improving faster than he'd ever seen before. In 6 weeks, she'd gone from scattered shots to consistent groupings. In 8 weeks, she was outperforming shooters who'd been coming to the range for years. It was during her 10th week that things got interesting. Sarah had been working on a particularly challenging drill rapid-fire accuracy at 50 yards. Most recreational shooters never attempted anything beyond 25 yards. But Sarah had been pushing her limits systematically. She'd spent 3 sessions just getting comfortable with the distance, then gradually increased her speed. "You're overthinking it," called out Jake Sullivan, a regular who'd been watching her struggle with the timing. Jake was the kind of shooter who relied on instinct, the type who'd grown up hunting with his father and believed that too. Much analysis ruined the natural flow of marksmanship. Sarah lowered her rifle and turned to face him. "Overthinking what?" "All that calculating you do. Just point and shoot. Trust your gut." What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. She raised the rifle, took a breath, and without any of her usual deliberate aiming process, fired 5 rounds in rapid succession. When they checked the target, all 5 shots were clustered in the center ring. "Huh," Sarah said, staring at the results. "Interesting." But instead of celebrating, she immediately wanted to understand why it had worked. She spent the next hour trying to replicate the feeling, the mental state that had allowed her to shoot so intuitively. She asked Jake questions about his process, about how he knew when to pull the trigger. "It's not something you can explain," Jake said, growing frustrated. "It's just ... You know." Sarah nodded, but she wasn't satisfied. That night, she went home and researched everything she could find about intuitive shooting, about the neuroscience of muscle memory, about how experts in various fields moved beyond conscious thought to automatic response. She discovered studies about blindfolded basketball players, about musicians who could play complex pieces without looking at their instruments, about the way the brain processed spatial relationships below the threshold of conscious awareness. The more she read, the more convinced she became that there was something systematic about what others called instinct. The next evening, she arrived at the range with a request that made Frank Morrison uncomfortable. "I want to try something." Sarah said, pulling a black bandana from her bag. I want to see if I can shoot with my eyes closed. Frank immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. That's dangerous and frankly, it's stupid. Not completely closed, Sarah clarified. Just ... Limited vision. I want to understand how much I'm relying on sight versus other senses. Frank was about to refuse again when Marcus walked over, curious about the conversation. What's she want? To do? Frank explained, and Marcus frowned. You mean like blindfolded shooting? I've heard of that. There are competitions. There are? Sarah asked, suddenly interested. Yeah, it's a thing. Mostly for experienced shooters, though. People who've been shooting for decades. Frank felt outnumbered. She's been shooting for 2 months. 2 months of daily practice, Sarah corrected. That's over 60 hours of range time. Marcus looked at Frank, then at Sarah. What if we start small? Maybe just limiting her peripheral vision. See how she does? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Against his better judgment, Frank agreed to a compromise. Sarah could try shooting with a narrow field of vision, just enough to see the target, but not her surroundings. It was a baby step toward what she really wanted to try, but it was a start. The results were remarkable. With her vision restricted, Sarah's other senses seemed to sharpen. She could hear the subtle differences in her breathing, feel the micro-tremors. In her hands, sense the exact moment when her body was perfectly aligned. Her scores that day were the best she'd ever achieved. This is just the beginning, Sarah told Frank as she packed up her equipment. I want to see how far I can push this. Frank watched her leave, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. He'd seen obsessive shooters before, but Sarah was different. She wasn't just trying to get better. She was trying to understand. Something fundamental about the nature of accuracy itself. What he didn't know was that Sarah had already ordered books on spatial cognition, proprioception, and the psychology of expert performance. She was planning to treat blindfolded shooting not as a stunt, but as a scientific experiment, and she was about to prove that everything the shooting community thought they knew about marksmanship was wrong. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Sarah's journey into blindfolded shooting began with what she called sensory mapping, a methodical process of understanding how her body interacted with the rifle when vision was removed from the equation. She started by spending entire sessions with her eyes closed, not shooting, just holding the rifle. She'd practice mounting it to her shoulder, finding the natural point of aim, understanding how her body wanted to settle into position. Frank Morrison watched these sessions with growing bewilderment. She's not even firing, he told Marcus during one of their evening discussions. She just stands there for 20 minutes with that rifle, eyes closed, not moving. Marcus had been researching blindfolded shooting since Sarah's request. I found some videos online. There's a guy in Texas who's been doing this for years. He says it's all about proprioception, knowing where your body is in space without looking. Frank wasn't convinced. That's fine for someone who's been shooting for decades. She's been here for 3 months. But Sarah's unconventional training was yielding results. When she did fire with limited vision, her accuracy had improved dramatically. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when everything was aligned perfectly. Other shooters began to take notice. Elena Rodriguez, a competitive shooter who trained at Riverside twice a week, found herself fascinated by Sarah's approach. Elena had been shooting professionally for 8 years, competing in national championships, but she'd never seen anyone train the way Sarah did. What are you trying to accomplish? Elena asked one evening, approaching Sarah's lane. Sarah looked up from her notebook, where she'd been recording the day's observations. I'm trying to understand the difference between conscious aiming and subconscious targeting. Elena raised an eyebrow. That's not how most people think about shooting. Most people plateau, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. They hit a level of competence and stop improving. I want to understand why. Elena found herself drawn into Sarah's systematic approach. She started staying after her own training sessions to observe Sarah's methods. What she saw challenged everything she thought she knew about marksmanship. Sarah had developed a series of exercises that seemed almost meditative. She'd stand at the firing line with the rifle shouldered, eyes closed, and slowly breathe while making microscopic adjustments to her position. She was training her body to recognize the feeling of perfect alignment. It's like she's calibrating herself, Elena explained to her coach, David Kim, over the phone. She's not just practicing shooting. She's practicing being in the exact right position to shoot. David, who'd coached Olympic-level shooters, was skeptical. Muscle memory is important, but there's no substitute for visual aiming. You can't just feel your way to accuracy. But Sarah was proving otherwise. By her 4th month at the range, she could consistently hit center mass at 25 yards with her eyes closed. Not blindfolded, that was still too advanced, but with her eyes simply shut, relying entirely on her sense of position and timing. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating session. Sarah had been working on extending her range while maintaining accuracy with limited vision. She'd been stuck at the same distance for a week, unable to push beyond 30 yards without her groupings falling apart. "You're fighting yourself," observed Dr. Patricia Ng, a neuroscientist who'd started coming to the range after hearing about Sarah's experiments from a mutual friend. Patricia studied motor learning and was fascinated by Sarah's approach to skill acquisition. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, lowering her rifle. Patricia walked over to the lane. "You're trying to control something that needs to be automatic. It's like trying to consciously control your heartbeat. The harder you try, the more you interfere with the natural process." Sarah considered this. "So I need to trust the training." "Exactly. You've put in the work. Your body knows what to do. You just need to let it happen." That evening, Sarah tried something different. Instead of her usual methodical approach, she simply stepped up to the line, closed her eyes, and fired without conscious thought. The shot hit dead center at 35 yards. "Holy shit," muttered Tommy Chun, a range regular who'd been watching from the next lane. "Did you see that?" Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the target, then at the growing crowd of shooters who'd gathered to watch. She realized she'd attracted an audience without noticing. "Do it again," called out Janet Pierce, a former military sniper who'd been skeptical of Sarah's methods from the beginning. Sarah took a breath, closed her eyes, and fired again. Another center hit. The crowd grew silent. In the shooting world, consistency was everything. Anyone could get lucky once, but repeatability was what separated good shooters from great ones. "One more," Janet said. Her voice tense. Sarah fired a 3rd shot. Center ring. The silence stretched until Frank Morrison's voice cut through it. "Okay, that's enough showing off. Let's get back to normal practice." But normal practice was over. Word of Sarah's demonstration spread through the local shooting community like wildfire. Within days, people were driving from across the state to see the blind shooter at Riverside Range. Sarah found the attention uncomfortable. She'd never been seeking an audience. She'd been conducting an experiment. But the constant stream of visitors disrupted her training routine. People wanted to see her shoot with her eyes closed, wanted to understand her methods, wanted to challenge her abilities. "I can't concentrate with all these people watching," she told Frank during a particularly crowded session. Frank had been dealing with the increased traffic for 2 weeks, and it was becoming a problem. "Look, maybe you should consider doing some kind of demonstration. Get it out of everyone's system." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not ready. I'm still learning." But the pressure was mounting. Local gun shops were sending customers to see her shoot. A shooting instructor from Colorado Springs had driven up specifically to observe her technique. Even the range's insurance company had called with questions about liability. The tipping point came when Derek Morrison, Frank's nephew and a competitive shooter himself, arrived unannounced with 3 friends from the State Shooting Association. "I want to see this blind shooting thing," Derek announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Frank's been talking about it for weeks." Frank looked embarrassed. "Derek, she's just practicing. She doesn't perform on command." "Come on," Derek pressed. "If she's as good as you say, she won't mind showing us." Sarah had been trying to ignore the conversation, but Derek's tone was beginning to irritate her. She'd encountered this attitude before, the assumption that because she was relatively new to shooting, she must be some kind of novelty act. "What exactly do you want to see?" Sarah asked, setting down her rifle. Derek grinned. "I want to see you hit that target at 50 yards with your eyes closed. No tricks, no special equipment." Sarah looked at the target, then at the crowd of people who'd gathered to watch. 50 yards was beyond what she'd been practicing. She'd been working methodically up to that distance, but she wasn't confident in her consistency yet. "I'll try," she said finally, "but I'm not making any promises." Derek's grin widened. "Fair enough." Sarah stepped up to the line, loaded her rifle, and took her stance. The range fell completely silent. She closed her eyes, took 3 deep breaths, and fired. The shot hit the outer ring of the target. Not bad for 50 yards, but not the demonstration of perfection the crowd had been expecting. "Interesting," Derek said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Try again." Sarah's second shot was closer to center, but still not the precision she'd been achieving at shorter distances. She could feel the disappointment in the crowd, the sense that the blind shooter wasn't living up to the hype. "One more," Derek called out. "Third time's the charm." Sarah felt the pressure building. Every eye in the range was on her. She'd never shot under this kind of scrutiny before, and it was affecting her concentration. She took longer to set up, trying to recapture the calm focus that had served her so well in private practice. The third shot missed the target entirely. Derek's laughter broke the tension. "Well, I guess the rumors were exaggerated." Sarah opened her eyes and stared at the target, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. She'd let the crowd get to her, had tried to perform beyond her current abilities. "It's harder than it looks," Frank said diplomatically, trying to defuse the situation. But Derek wasn't finished. Maybe she should stick to shooting with her eyes open. Leave the trick shots to the professionals. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her. Not anger exactly, but a cold determination. She'd been treating her blindfolded shooting as a personal experiment, but Derek's dismissal made her realize that it had become something more. She was representing a different approach to marksmanship, one that challenged the traditional assumptions about how shooting should be taught and practiced. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "I should stick to what I know." She packed up her equipment and left the range, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd. But as she drove home, she wasn't thinking about Derek's dismissal or the failed demonstration. She was thinking about the fundamental problem she'd been trying to solve. She'd been approaching blindfolded shooting as if it were just regular shooting with one sense removed. But what if it was something entirely different? What if the key wasn't to shoot blind, but to shoot beyond sight? That night, Sarah began planning the most ambitious phase of her training yet. She was going to push her abilities to their absolute limit, not for the crowd at the range, but for herself. She wanted to understand what was possible when someone completely reimagined the relationship between shooter and target, and she was going to do it in a way that would make Derek Morrison's skepticism look like exactly what it was: a failure of imagination. Sarah's training entered a new phase that bordered on the obsessive. She transformed her one-bedroom apartment into a makeshift laboratory for understanding spatial awareness. Using a laser pointer and mirrors, she created a system to practice rifle alignment without actually firing. She'd spend hours in her living room, eyes closed, practicing the motion of shouldering the rifle and finding what she called her 0 point, the position where everything felt perfectly centered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Ng had been following Sarah's progress with professional interest and suggested she connect with Dr. Michael Torres, a vision researcher at the University of Colorado who specialized in spatial cognition. "What you're attempting," Dr. Torres explained, during their first meeting, is similar to what we see in elite athletes who perform in low visibility conditions. Ice hockey players tracking a puck, baseball players hitting in twilight games. The brain develops alternative pathways for spatial processing. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "You mean there's actual science behind this?" "Absolutely. The visual cortex is incredibly adaptable. When you remove visual input, other sensory systems compensate. But it's not just compensation, it's integration. Your brain is learning to process spatial relationships through proprioception, auditory cues, and even subtle air pressure changes." Dr. Torres arranged for Sarah to undergo a series of tests at the university's neuroscience lab. The results were remarkable. Her spatial processing abilities had dramatically improved over the past month. Brain scans showed increased activity in regions associated with body awareness and spatial mapping. "This is what we call neuroplasticity in action," Dr. Torres explained, showing Sarah the colorful brain images. "Your neural networks are literally rewiring themselves to support this new skill." Armed with this scientific validation, Sarah returned to the range with renewed confidence. But she also implemented a crucial change in her approach. She stopped caring about the audience. Frank Morrison noticed the difference immediately. "She's like a different person," he told Marcus. "Before, she'd get distracted by people watching. Now she doesn't even seem to notice them." Sarah had developed what she called bubble training, a mental technique for creating a zone of focus that excluded external distractions. She'd learned it from studying meditation practices and adapted it for shooting. When she stepped up to the firing line, she could literally shut out the world. This mental discipline proved crucial because the crowds at Riverside Range were growing larger. Word of the blind shooter had spread beyond the local shooting community. A firearms blogger from Phoenix had driven up to document her training. A YouTube channel about unusual sports had contacted Frank about filming a segment, but the person who would change everything was Rebecca Martinez, a former Army sniper who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Rebecca had heard about Sarah through military channels and came to the range on a Tuesday evening when the crowds were smaller. "I want to see what you can do," Rebecca said simply, approaching Sarah's lane. "No audience, no pressure, just shooter to shooter." Sarah looked up from cleaning her rifle. Rebecca had the kind of presence that commanded attention, tall, athletic, with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. "What distance?" Sarah asked. 75 yards, eyes closed, 5 shots. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. 75 yards was beyond her comfort zone, but Rebecca's matter-of-fact tone suggested this was a reasonable request. "Okay," Sarah said, moving to the firing line. What happened next surprised both women. Sarah's first shot hit the center ring. The second was slightly off, but still well within the target. The third, fourth, and fifth shots were all center mass. Rebecca studied the target through binoculars, then looked at Sarah with genuine respect. "That's military-grade accuracy. How long have you been training?" 6 months, Sarah replied. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "I've been shooting for 15 years. I couldn't do what you just did." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged Sarah's achievement without qualification or skepticism. Rebecca understood, in a way that recreational shooters couldn't, just how extraordinary it was to achieve that level of precision without visual reference. "I want to train with you," Rebecca said. "Not to learn blindfolded shooting, but to understand your mental approach. I've never seen focus like that. Sarah found herself with an unexpected training partner. Rebecca brought military discipline to their sessions, pushing Sarah to maintain accuracy under increasingly difficult conditions. They trained in different weather, at different times of day, with various distractions. Combat shooting isn't about perfect conditions, Rebecca explained. It's about performing when everything is working against you. Under Rebecca's guidance, Sarah learned to shoot accurately while tired, stressed, and rushed. She discovered that her blindfolded training had developed a kind of mental resilience that translated to all aspects of marksmanship. The partnership also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Captain James Rodriguez, Rebecca's former commanding officer, visited the range after hearing about their training sessions. "Martinez tells me you're doing something unusual here," Captain Rodriguez said, observing Sarah's practice routine. "Mind if I watch?" Sarah had grown accustomed to military personnel observing her training. They approached her abilities with professional interest rather than casual curiosity. Captain Rodriguez watched silently as Sarah worked through a series of shots at various distances, all with her eyes closed. "Impressive," he said finally. "Have you considered competitive shooting?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not interested in competition. This is about understanding the limits of human performance." Captain Rodriguez exchanged a look with Rebecca. "There's something you should know. The military is always interested in innovative training methods. What you're doing here could have applications beyond recreational shooting." The conversation planted a seed that would grow into Sarah's next challenge. If her methods worked for precision shooting, what else might they work for? She began researching other fields where spatial awareness was crucial: surgery, aviation, even dance. But her exploration was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Derek Morrison returned to the range, this time with a proposition. "I owe you an apology," Derek said, approaching Sarah during a quiet afternoon session. "I was wrong about your abilities." Sarah looked up from her rifle, surprised by the admission. "Okay, I've been hearing things," Derek continued. "People are saying you're better than some professional shooters. I want to put that to the test." Sarah felt a familiar wariness. "What kind of test?" Derek smiled, but there was something calculating in his expression. "I want to organize a proper demonstration. Not just a few shots for curious onlookers. A real test of your abilities." "I'm not interested in performing," Sarah said, turning back to her rifle. "This isn't about performance," Derek pressed. "It's about legitimacy. Right now, you're just a story people tell. But if you can demonstrate your skills in a controlled environment, with proper documentation, you could change how people think about marksmanship training." Sarah considered this. She'd been content to pursue her research in private, but Derek's point about legitimacy resonated. If her methods could genuinely improve shooting instruction, didn't she have a responsibility to share them? "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Derek outlined his plan. He wanted to organize a formal demonstration at the range, with multiple witnesses from the shooting community. Sarah would attempt increasingly difficult shots while blindfolded, with everything recorded for verification. "Think of it as a scientific demonstration," Derek said. "You're not just showing off. You're proving that your methods work." Sarah was intrigued, despite her reservations. "What's the most difficult shot you want me to attempt?" Derek's smile widened. 100 yards, blindfolded, multiple targets. If you can do that, no one will ever question your abilities again." Sarah felt a chill of excitement mixed with fear. 100 yards was sniper territory. She'd never attempted anything close to that distance without vision. But the challenge appealed to the same part of her that had driven her to push beyond conventional training methods. "I'll need time to prepare," she said finally. "How much time?" Sarah thought about the distance, about the precision required, about the mental preparation she'd need. 2 weeks, Derek nodded. 2 weeks. I'll handle the arrangements." As Derek left, Sarah realized she'd just committed to the most ambitious test of her abilities yet. But she also felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. This was what she'd been training for without knowing it, a chance to prove that her approach to marksmanship wasn't just unusual, but revolutionary. That evening, she called Dr. Torres to discuss the neurological aspects of extreme distance shooting without vision. She called Rebecca to design a training regimen that would prepare her for the challenge. She even reached out to Frank, asking him to help her understand the ballistics of long-range shooting. What she didn't know was that Derek Morrison had his own reasons for organizing the demonstration. He'd been contacted by a sports television producer who was interested in featuring unusual athletic achievements. Derek saw an opportunity to turn Sarah's abilities into something much bigger than a local shooting range curiosity. The next 2 weeks would determine whether Sarah Chun was ready for the kind of scrutiny that came with genuine fame, or whether she'd crack under the pressure of having to perform the impossible on command. The 2 weeks of preparation became the most intensive training period of Sarah's life. She arrived at the range before dawn and stayed until closing, methodically working her way up to longer distances. But this wasn't just about increasing range, it was about understanding the completely different physics of long-distance shooting. Rebecca Martinez had called in favors to get Sarah access to a military training facility outside Denver where she could practice at 100 yards without the distractions of civilian shooters. The facility was stark and professional, with precision equipment that made the gear at Riverside Range look like toys. Long-distance shooting is a different science, explained Sergeant First Class Alex Thompson, the facility's chief marksmanship instructor. You're dealing with wind drift, bullet drop, air density. Variables that don't matter at 50 yards become critical at 100. Sarah absorbed this information with the same systematic approach she'd applied to everything else. She spent hours studying ballistics charts, understanding how a bullet's trajectory changed over distance. She learned to read wind patterns, to feel the subtle changes in air pressure that could throw off a shot. But the most challenging aspect was mental. At shorter distances, Sarah had developed an intuitive sense of target location. At 100 yards, that intuition broke down. She had to develop an entirely new kind of spatial awareness. It's like learning to shoot all over again, she told Dr. Torres during one of their consultation sessions. Everything I thought I understood about distance and accuracy has to be recalibrated. Dr. Torres had been monitoring Sarah's progress with fascination. Your brain is adapting to process spatial information at scales it wasn't originally designed for. It's remarkable. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating session. Sarah had been struggling with consistency at 90 yards, her shots scattered in a pattern that suggested she was close, but not quite there. Rebecca watched from the observation deck, noting the subtle changes in Sarah's posture and breathing. You're thinking too much, Rebecca called down. At this distance, you can't calculate your way to accuracy. You have to feel it. Sarah lowered her rifle, frustrated. Feel what? I can't see anything. That's the point, Rebecca replied, walking down to the firing line. You've been trying to apply your short-range techniques to long-range shooting, but they're different skills entirely. Rebecca had Sarah try a different approach. Instead of the careful, methodical setup she'd perfected, Sarah would fire immediately upon shouldering the rifle. No time to think, no opportunity to second-guess herself. The first shot hit the center ring at 90 yards. Again, Rebecca said. The second shot was equally accurate. Now you're getting it, Rebecca said with satisfaction. Long-range blindfolded shooting isn't about precision, it's about trust. Trust in your training, trust in your setup, trust in your body's ability to find the target. Over the next week, Sarah refined this new approach. She learned to distinguish between the conscious precision needed for short-range shooting and the intuitive flow required for long distances. By the end of the week, she was hitting targets consistently at 100 yards, But Derek Morrison's demonstration would involve more than just distance. He'd designed a challenge that would test every aspect of Sarah's abilities. Multiple targets, Derek explained during a planning meeting at the range. 5 different distances, from 25 yards to 100 yards. You'll have to hit them in sequence, still blindfolded, with time limits for each shot. Sarah felt a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. Time limits? 30 seconds per target. Real-world conditions don't allow for extended preparation. Frank Morrison, who'd been listening to the plans with growing unease, finally spoke up. This is getting out of hand. She's not a circus performer. But Sarah was already calculating the logistics. What about target size? Are we talking standard bullseye targets or something different? Derek smiled. Standard targets at 25 and 50 yards. Smaller targets at 75 and 100 yards. The final target will be a playing card at 100 yards. The room fell silent. Even Rebecca, who'd been supportive of pushing Sarah's limits, looked concerned. A playing card? Frank repeated. At 100 yards, blindfolded? That's not marksmanship. That's impossible. Is it? Derek asked, looking directly at Sarah. You've already proven that impossible is just another word for untested. Sarah stared at Derek, understanding that this had moved beyond a simple demonstration. This was about proving something fundamental about human potential, about the limits of what could be achieved through systematic training and mental discipline. I'll need to modify my training, she said finally. A playing card is a completely different challenge than a target. You have 4 days, Derek replied. The next 4 days pushed Sarah to her absolute limits. She worked with Rebecca to develop new techniques for extremely small targets. They discovered that shooting at a playing card required not just accuracy, but a different kind of mental visualization. You can't think about the card, Rebecca explained. You have to think about the space around it. The card becomes an absence of space rather than a presence. Sarah practiced this concept obsessively. She learned to sense the precise location of small objects without seeing them, to feel the exact moment when her rifle was aligned with something no bigger than a few square inches. Dr. Torres, who'd been monitoring Sarah's preparation, was amazed by the neural adaptations he was observing. Your brain is developing spatial processing capabilities that we previously thought were impossible. You're literally rewriting the textbook on human spatial cognition. But the scientific implications were secondary to the immediate challenge. Word of the upcoming demonstration had spread throughout the shooting community. People were driving from neighboring states to witness what many considered either a historic achievement or an elaborate hoax. The night before the demonstration, Sarah sat in her apartment, rifle disassembled for cleaning, trying to process what she'd committed to. In 8 months, she'd gone from complete novice to attempting something that experienced shooters considered impossible. Rebecca called just after midnight. How are you feeling? Terrified, Sarah admitted, and excited, and completely unprepared. You're more prepared than anyone has ever been for something like this, Rebecca said. Trust your training. What if I miss? Then you miss. But you'll have tried something nobody else has ever attempted. That's worth something. Sarah spent the final hours before dawn in meditation, using the mental techniques she'd developed to center herself and shut out the noise of anticipation and fear. When she finally arrived at the range, she was calmer than she'd been in weeks. The shooting bay had been transformed. Professional lighting equipment illuminated the firing line. Video cameras were positioned at multiple angles. A crowd of over 200 people filled the observation area, including local media, shooting instructors, and curious members of the public. Derek Morrison stood at the center of it all, clearly enjoying his role as master of ceremonies. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, today we're going to witness something unprecedented in the history of marksmanship. Sarah barely heard the introduction. She was focused on the targets, now visible at their various distances. The playing card at 100 yards looked impossibly small, a tiny white rectangle that seemed to mock her ambition. Frank Morrison approached as she prepared her equipment. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Nobody would blame you for walking away." Sarah looked at him, then at the crowd, then at the targets. "Yes, I do. Not for them. For me." She picked up her rifle and walked to the firing line, the black bandana that would soon cover her eyes folded neatly in her left hand. The moment she'd been training for had finally arrived. The crowd fell silent as Sarah took her position. Everything she'd learned over the past 8 months, the science, the technique, the mental discipline, would be tested in the next few minutes. What happened next would either validate her revolutionary approach to marksmanship or prove that some boundaries of human performance simply couldn't be crossed. The silence in the shooting bay was absolute. Sarah stood at the firing line, her rifle resting against her shoulder, the black bandana in her left hand. 200 pairs of eyes watched her every movement, but she'd already begun the mental process of shutting them out. "Are you ready?" Derek Morrison's voice cut through the quiet. Sarah nodded, then tied the bandana across her eyes. The world disappeared, replaced by the heightened awareness she'd spent months developing. She could hear someone's nervous breathing 20 feet away, feel the subtle air currents created by the ventilation system, sense the exact position of her body in space. "Target 1, Derek announced. 25 yards, standard bullseye, 30 seconds. Sarah had practiced the sequence dozens of times, but never with an audience, never with cameras recording every movement. She took a deep breath, shouldered the rifle, and felt for that familiar point of perfect alignment. The shot rang out. A spotter with binoculars called out, "Dead center." The crowd stirred, a mix of impressed murmurs and skeptical whispers. Sarah heard Derek's voice. "Target 2. 50 yards, 30 seconds. This was where her training truly began. 50 yards was the distance where she'd first understood that blindfolded shooting wasn't about compensating for lost vision. It was about accessing a different kind of awareness entirely. She fired. Center ring. The spotter confirmed. Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her. The crowd, the cameras, the pressure, it all faded into background noise. She was in the zone she'd discovered during her most intense training sessions, a state where conscious thought gave way to pure, trained instinct. Target 3, 75 yards, 30 seconds. Now the real challenge began. At 75 yards, the margin for error became razor thin. Sarah had to trust everything she'd learned about long-distance shooting, about reading wind patterns, through subtle changes in air pressure, about the way her body naturally wanted to position itself for maximum accuracy. She fired. The pause before the spotter's confirmation felt eternal. Hit. Outer ring, but it's a hit. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The outer ring at 75 yards was still exceptional accuracy for blindfolded shooting. She was ahead of schedule, still within the zone of focus that made everything else irrelevant. Target 4, 100 yards, 30 seconds. The crowd's energy shifted. Even the skeptics understood that hitting a target at 100 yards without vision was entering the realm of the extraordinary. Sarah could sense the tension in the room, the collective holding of breath. She shouldered the rifle and felt for the alignment that had become second nature. But at 100 yards, second nature wasn't enough. She had to access the deeper level of awareness that Rebecca had helped her discover, the place where trust replaced technique. She fired. The silence stretched endlessly. Finally, the spotter's voice. "Hit. It's a hit." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it. She was preparing for the final target, the one that would either cement her reputation or prove that some boundaries couldn't be crossed. "Final target," Derek announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet range. 100 yards. Playing card. 30 seconds. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Everything she'd learned, every hour of practice, every moment of doubt and breakthrough it, all came down to this single shot. A playing card at 100 yards, blindfolded, with 200 witnesses. Watching she thought about Dr. Torres and his explanations of neuroplasticity, about Rebecca's lessons in trusting instinct over analysis, about Frank's initial skepticism and eventual support. She thought about the journey that had brought her from complete novice to this impossible moment. Then she stopped thinking entirely. Sarah shouldered the rifle and felt the familiar weight settle into position. But this time, instead of searching for alignment, she simply allowed her body to find it. She'd trained for this moment so thoroughly that her muscles knew exactly what to do. The playing card was invisible to her, but she could sense its location, with the same certainty that she knew where her own hands were. It wasn't sight or sound or any single sense. It was the integration of everything she'd learned about spatial awareness, about the relationship between shooter and target, about the physics of precision at distance. She fired. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't the quiet of anticipation, it was the silence of disbelief. Sarah could feel the crowd's collective shock, the sense that they'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. Finally, the spotter's voice broke through. Direct hit. She hit the card. The explosion of sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. 200 people erupting in cheers, applause, and shouts of amazement. She pulled off the bandana and looked downrange, where the playing card, now with a bullet hole through its center, fluttered in the breeze. Derek Morrison was at her side immediately, his face flushed with excitement. That was incredible. Do you realize what you just did? Sarah looked at him, then at the crowd of people pressing forward to congratulate her. Frank Morrison was pushing through the crowd, his face showing a mixture of pride and amazement. Rebecca Martinez stood at the back, nodding with satisfaction. I proved a point, Sarah said quietly. You proved more than a point, Derek replied. You just redefined what's possible in marksmanship. The aftermath was overwhelming. Local news crews wanted interviews. Shooting instructors wanted to understand her methods. The video of her performance, uploaded to social media within hours, began going viral. But Sarah found herself oddly detached from the celebration. She'd achieved something remarkable, but now she was thinking about what came next. She'd proven that her methods worked, that systematic training could push human performance beyond previously accepted limits. Dr. Torres approached as the crowd began to thin. I've been documenting your progress for months, he said. What you accomplished today isn't just impressive, it's scientifically significant. You've demonstrated neuroplasticity in action. Sarah nodded, but she was already thinking beyond the demonstration. This is just the beginning. If these techniques work for marksmanship, what else might they work for? Captain Rodriguez, who'd been watching from the observation deck, joined the conversation. The military applications alone could be revolutionary. We're going to want to study your methods extensively. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life changed completely. She was invited to speak at shooting schools, to consult with military training programs, to work with researchers studying human performance. The quiet software engineer who'd bought a Groupon for shooting lessons had become a recognized expert in human potential, but the transformation that mattered most was internal. Sarah had discovered that the boundaries of human performance weren't fixed, they were simply unexplored. She'd proven that with systematic training and mental discipline, people could achieve things that seemed impossible. The playing card with the bullet hole through its center sat framed on her desk, a reminder, not of what she'd accomplished, but of what might be possible next. She'd started with a simple question about marksmanship and ended up discovering something fundamental about human potential, and she was just getting started. Frank Morrison, watching Sarah pack up her equipment after another successful training session, shook his head in wonder. "You know, when you first walked in here with that group on, I thought you were just another weekend warrior who'd lose interest in a month." Sarah smiled, slinging her rifle case over her shoulder. "Shows what you know about assumptions." "Yeah," Frank replied, "it sure does." As Sarah walked toward the exit, she passed the lane where she'd first struggled to hit a target at 25 yards. The journey from that first scattered shot to a playing card at 100 yards had taken less than a year, but it had taught her something more valuable than marksmanship. She'd learned that the only real limits were the ones people accepted. Without question. Everything else was just another problem waiting to be solved. 6 months after the demonstration that changed everything, Sarah Chun stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, delivering a lecture on revolutionary training methodologies. The audience included military officers, sports scientists, and performance coaches from around the world. "The human brain is far more adaptable than we previously understood," Sarah explained, clicking a slide showing brain scans from her training progression. "What we call impossible is often just untrained." In the audience, Rebecca Martinez smiled as she watched her former training partner command the room with the same focus she'd once applied to shooting. Rebecca was now implementing Sarah's techniques in military sniper training programs, with results that were reshaping combat. Marksmanship doctrine. The ripple effects of that single demonstration had spread far beyond the shooting community. Sarah's methods were being adapted for surgical training, where doctors needed to perform precise procedures with limited visual access. Pilots were using her spatial awareness techniques for low-visibility flying. Even musicians were applying her principles to play complex pieces without sheet music. Dr. Torres, now co-authoring research papers with Sarah on neuroplasticity and skill acquisition, had documented changes in her brain that challenged fundamental assumptions about human learning. The scientific community was still grappling with the implications of what she'd achieved, but perhaps the most significant change was at Riverside Shooting Range itself. Frank Morrison had transformed the facility into a research center for unconventional training methods. Students came from across the country to learn Sarah's techniques, and the range had become a pilgrimage site for anyone interested in pushing human performance beyond traditional limits. "The funny thing is," Frank told a documentary crew filming at the range, "I thought she was just another tech worker looking for a hobby." Shows you how wrong you can be about people. The documentary, titled Beyond Sight, The Sarah Chin Method, had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was now being distributed internationally. It featured interviews with neuroscientists, military officials, and athletes who'd incorporated Sarah's techniques into their training regimens. The film had sparked a global conversation about human potential and the nature of expertise. Derek Morrison, who'd organized the original demonstration, had parlayed the event into a career as a sports promoter specializing in extreme human performance challenges. But he'd learned to treat the athletes with more respect after seeing what Sarah had accomplished through pure determination and systematic training. His latest venture was organizing a new competitive sport called Precision Without Sight, where athletes competed in various blindfolded challenges. The playing card with the bullet hole through its center had become something of a legend in the shooting world. It was displayed in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History as part of an exhibit on human achievement, alongside artifacts from other breakthrough moments in human performance. School groups toured the exhibit daily, learning about the importance of persistence and scientific thinking. Major sporting goods companies had reached out to Sarah, wanting to develop training equipment based on her methods. Nike had created a line of blindfolded training gear for athletes. Glock had commissioned a special edition rifle inspired by Sarah's setup. The economic impact of her breakthrough was reaching millions of dollars as industries discovered applications for her techniques, but for Sarah, the most meaningful change was personal. She discovered that excellence wasn't about talent or natural ability. It was about the willingness to question assumptions and push beyond accepted limitations. The quiet, methodical approach that had made her a successful software engineer had proven equally effective in revolutionizing marksmanship training. Technology companies had begun recruiting Sarah to consult on user interface design, recognizing that her understanding of spatial cognition could improve how people interacted with digital environments. Her insights were being incorporated into virtual reality systems, helping developers create more intuitive interfaces for users who couldn't rely on traditional visual cues. The medical field had embraced her work with particular enthusiasm. Surgeons were using modified versions of her training to improve their performance in minimally invasive procedures. Dr. Amanda Foster, a cardiac surgeon at Johns Hopkins, had reduced her surgical error rate by 30% after implementing Sarah's spatial awareness techniques. Emergency room doctors were learning to make critical decisions with limited visual information, using principles adapted from Sarah's methods. On this particular evening, Sarah was back at Riverside Range for her weekly practice session. Despite her international recognition, she still maintained the disciplined training routine that had made everything possible. But now she wasn't alone. A new generation of students worked alongside her, learning to push their own boundaries. Among them was Lisa Park, a former college athlete who'd lost her sight in a car accident and was now learning to shoot competitively using Sarah's techniques. There was Marcus Williams, a veteran with PTSD who found that the mental discipline required for blindfolded shooting helped him manage his anxiety. And there was Jennifer Rodriguez, Elena's teenage daughter, who was applying Sarah's spatial awareness methods to competitive archery. The most remarkable student was 8-year-old David Kim, a child prodigy who'd been born with a rare visual impairment. Using Sarah's methods, David had developed spatial processing abilities that amazed researchers. He could navigate complex environments and perform precise motor tasks with accuracy that surpassed many sighted individuals. His progress was being documented by child development specialists who believed Sarah's techniques could revolutionize education for visually impaired children. The key, Sarah told her students as they wrapped up the evening session, isn't to copy what I did. It's to understand the principles behind it and apply them to your own challenges. Lisa raised her hand. What's next for you? You've already proven that blindfolded shooting is possible. What's the next impossible thing? Sarah smiled, looking out at the range where her journey had begun. I'm working with a team of researchers on something we call predictive accuracy shooting at targets that aren't stationary. Moving targets, changing distances, variable conditions. The students exchanged excited glances. If Sarah Chun said something was possible, they'd learn to take her seriously. But Sarah's next challenge was even more ambitious than her students realized. She was collaborating with NASA to develop training protocols for astronauts who might need to perform precise tasks in zero gravity with limited visual reference. The space agency was interested in her techniques for maintaining spatial orientation in disorienting environments. The military applications had expanded beyond sniper training. Special forces units were using her methods to improve performance in low-light combat situations. Navy SEALs were learning to navigate underwater environments with reduced visibility. The Pentagon had classified much of the research, but Sarah's influence on military training doctrine was becoming profound. International Olympic committees had begun investigating whether blindfolded competitions should be included in future games. The World Shooting Federation was developing new categories for sight-limited competitions. Sarah's demonstration had essentially created an entirely new sport with its own governing bodies and championship events. As the students packed up their equipment and headed home, Sarah remained at the range for a few minutes longer. She walked to Lane 7, where she'd first attempted blindfolded shooting months earlier. Where skeptics had gathered to watch her fail, Frank Morrison joined her, looking out at the targets that had witnessed so many breakthrough moments. The range had been featured in countless news reports and documentaries. Tour groups came through weekly, wanting to see where the impossible had become possible. Any regrets? He asked. Sarah considered the question. Her life had become infinitely more complex since that first demonstration. She traveled constantly, spoke at conferences, consulted with organizations around the world. The quiet simplicity of her old life was gone forever. No, she said finally. I learned something important. Everyone has capabilities they don't know about. Most people just never push hard enough to discover them. Frank nodded. Think you'll ever top the playing card shot? Sarah picked up her rifle case and headed toward the exit. Frank, I'm just getting started. The range had installed a memorial plaque at Lane 7, commemorating the day Sarah had first attempted blindfolded shooting. It read, "Here, on this spot, Sarah Chun proved that human potential knows no boundaries." Her journey reminds us that what we call impossible is often just untested. Outside, the Denver skyline glittered in the distance. Sarah drove home through familiar streets, past the coffee shop where she'd first seen the Groupon advertisement that started everything, past the apartment complex where she'd practiced rifle alignment in her living room. Her phone buzzed with messages, interview requests, collaboration proposals, invitations to speak at universities and military academies. Each opportunity represented a chance to help others discover their own hidden capabilities. There was a message from Dr. Torres about a breakthrough in their research on neuroplasticity. Another from Rebecca about a new military training program. A third from a robotics company wanting to apply her spatial awareness principles to autonomous navigation systems. But tomorrow, she'd be back at the range, working on the next seemingly impossible challenge. Because Sarah Chun had learned the most important lesson of all. The only real limitation was the willingness to accept that something couldn't be done, and she was never willing to accept that again. The Chun Institute for Human Performance had been established with donations from organizations that had benefited from her techniques. The institute was developing new training methodologies for firefighters, police officers, and search and rescue teams. They were exploring how Sarah's principles could help people perform critical tasks under extreme stress or in dangerous conditions. Universities were offering her tenure-track positions. Fortune 500 companies wanted her to redesign their training programs. Publishers were bidding on her book rights. But Sarah remained focused on the research, on pushing the boundaries of what humans could achieve. She'd received letters from thousands of people who'd been inspired by her story. Students who'd overcome learning disabilities, athletes who'd broken through performance plateaus, professionals who'd found new levels of excellence in their fields. Each letter reminded her that her breakthrough had been about more than marksmanship, had been about human potential itself, the story of the woman who'd been ignored until she hit. Every target blindfolded had become something larger, a demonstration that human potential was far greater than anyone had imagined. Sarah had proven that with systematic training, scientific understanding, and unwavering determination, the impossible was just another word for unexplored. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah glanced at the framed playing card on her passenger seat, a reminder not of what she'd accomplished, but of what she'd yet to discover about the limits of human performance. Her home had become a shrine to human achievement. Awards lined the walls, but more importantly, research data covered every surface. Sarah was constantly analyzing new ways to push human capabilities, constantly questioning what people assumed was impossible. The journey that had begun with a simple Groupon voucher had become a revolution in understanding what people could achieve. And for Sarah Chun, it was still just the beginning. Inside her apartment, Sarah sat at her desk, surrounded by monitors displaying brain scans, performance data, and training protocols. She was designing the next phase of human performance research, planning experiments that would make her playing card shots seem like child's play, because Sarah Chun had learned that the only impossible thing was the willingness to stop trying. And she would never stop trying again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.